The idea is, it's come from an idea of like an artistic matchmaking, a kind of date service, but based on the idea that when we're at college or when we're in kind of sort of environment, deep, long conversation is quite common. We have it a lot. It's sort of like the way you interact with your tutors and that kind of thing. And then you leave college and you make work and you go to art, do sort of exhibitions and things. But that kind of artist-to-artist interaction doesn't happen so much. You get interviewed maybe by a lecturer or a kind of a writer or somebody that's researched your work or a journalist, and it's a very different line of questioning. So this idea, and it's also about connecting people and making proper connections with people based in Wales from artists that aren't based in Wales, because we need to tell the world why we're so fantastic, and that artist ripple effect, that conversation, I mean it's happened already with Simon's show, that his gallery in London picked up about the show, and they've been doing lots of social media about it, and I think it's important to get the message out to beyond the M4, or actually all along the M4, that it's really worth coming down here.
Should we start?
Go for it.
Okay. Well, obviously, this is meant to be a conversation between us two. We've had one conversation. I went down to Simon's studio on Friday, and that was a really interesting experience, and it was a lovely chat, actually. So we're going to try and kick off with where we sort of ended up. But obviously, this time we have an audience watching us or listening, and so that makes it slightly awkward, but it's okay. We'll try our best.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I'll kick off, shall I guess?
Yeah.
Okay. And this is definitely me interviewing Simon, really, because the return match is you interviewing me.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. But we also found out on Friday that we do cross over on quite a few things. Quite a few surprising things, actually. So hopefully we may talk about that. So the first thing is, I first of all texted you to say, I am here outside, and you said, great, I'm coming. And I waited. You came to the door of the studios, a complex of artist studios, about 20 minutes walk from Temple Meads. And then Simon came to the door, it was great, because we'd only spoken on the phone before, we hadn't actually met face to face. So he took me down to the studio, and I say down, and that was the first thing, that probably triggers a first question, is that we went down into very much a subterranean studio. No light at all, no natural light coming into that room. So it was very much a sense of being down. And you mentioned it by way of an explanation, I suppose, that you don't need that sort of external light. But as a way of kicking off, I suppose thinking about it in retrospect, when there's a subterranean feel to a studio, you don't see the outside world, it kind of, and we used the word earlier on, outside, it sort of may impact upon a way of working. I'm not sure, but what it does do, I think, it kind of removes any external factors, any distractions. And what I sense there, a compact space, but also a very concentrated space. Concentration and commitment to a mark, in your case, a cut.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that sense of concentration with no distractions?
For a minute.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the studio is, I haven't had that studio that long, a couple of years, and in fact, I didn't know that I was going to be getting a studio that didn't have any daylight. And my first thought was that would be problematic. I've often had studios that have a window at the very least. Not that I tend to look out the window that much, but just knowing it's sort of there is quite interesting. It does focus me, I think, in terms of concentration. I think what you've just said actually is completely true. I do quite like disappearing into the studio. The nice thing about having no daylight, it's a bit like being in an underground bar or something in the day. You completely lose sense of time. And I quite like that I don't know what's going on in the outside world. The only ever full-time job I've ever had was when I left school, and I worked in a photography lab, and it was a black and white custom printing thing. In some part of my life, I inadvertently kind of learnt an old-fashioned craft and a sort of an apprenticeship. And before my sort of college and art career life, if you like, then it was photography was my thing. And as a result of that, I then went to St Martin's to do film and video, first of all. It was a sort of extension of that. But the reason I mentioned the lab bit was that it was underground, and it suited being underground because obviously in a dark room you don't want to have any daylight. And it was a sort of funny place in South Kensington, quite a sort of smart embassy part of London. But going into this kind of subterranean world was actually quite fantastic in lots of ways. And the people that I worked with, it wasn't a massive company, but the people that I worked with were all slightly mad. And I think there was something about being underground in a dark red light environment all day long with chemicals that kind of made you go a bit bananas. But there was it's almost like a sort of womb, sort of creative room that you went into. All this stuff happened in it. I mean, really amazing things we used to print for people. And in a way, that studio in Bristol that I have now has that same feel to it. It's only because it's got a high enough ceiling that I think it works, because otherwise I think I would have felt too claustrophobic.
Yeah.
And as I said to you, it's quite a beautiful archival storage space. So I feel like I'm working in a sort of museum or something, which I quite like actually, because it allows me to kind of do lots of exploring with ideas. But it does totally concentrate me. I mean, I have no outside world intervention whatsoever, and it has a phone reception and stuff, but I don't really pay much attention to that.
So, you mentioned archival, the notion of your studio being a place where things are kept, because you have all the things in cabinets, past works, leftover bits as well. And I think what's striking, certainly during the conversation on Friday, was that, and this is in respect of light, is that when you are cutting with a scalpel, in a sense, is it over the top to suggest that one is scalping for light, for a form? Because we talked about the negative spaces that you take out.
Yeah.
Now, if we see these here, in fact, we're sitting down the right hand of them, aren't we? These are slightly different because these are moved on.
Yeah.
But of course, all of this negative is given prominence by the light bouncing off the wall coming through here.
Yeah.
So without that, we wouldn't have such a distinguished form.
I think it is about that. It's about holes and apertures.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there is a sort of photographic-y, link in those ways. I mean, I suppose quite early on I realised that in a way what I do is I make work by taking things away, which I know has some resonance with what you do as well. But it's also about making holes, and in a sort of facile level, it might just be picking holes in things to make art or something. But it is also about portals or apertures or holes, which then become these kind of slightly loaded entrances into something else. And I think we talked a bit about surface, and that kind of fairly recent sort of contemporary art obsession with surface to do with painters and stuff like that. But I think part of what I've always been interested in is achieving some sense of freedom or liberation. And that's sometimes to do with the kind of imagery that I might choose, lots of sorts of anarchy things or whatever, in a literal way, but also just the physical act of making something, about piercing a surface, penetrating a surface. And by that very definition, I suppose, it's about getting beyond to something. I don't know how successful I am at doing that, but that's the attempt anyway.
Yeah, no, I think we can safely say successful.
Successful.
Yeah, let's disagree that. But staying with the notion of piercing, creating holes piercing through something. There is a kind of, well, first of all, that suggests that one is looking for something beyond, as you've just said, but there's also a kind of thicket-like form that emerges time and again through the works, that one is literally, if one was to find a metaphor, one is searching through various layers or curtains, or indeed a thicket, literally, a rural thicket, in order to find, either another place or a sense of escape, a sense of security beyond, or another world beyond. In one of the introductions to one of the publications you've had, I think it's Michael Bracewell, isn't it? Is it Bracewell?
Yeah.
He mentions, and this is what struck me when I read this, he mentions the echoes of the neo-romanticists, which some of you will know, I'm sure. Neo-romanticists including people like Leslie Hurry and Graham Sutherland, Keith Vaughan, people like that. And that really, really struck me. And so we talked about this on Friday a little bit, because I personally also have found great solace, if you like, or strength of resolve by looking at people like Sutherland and Vaughan and others. And I was trying to put my finger on it why Bracewell raised this within your work, looking at your work, and of course it makes perfect sense now, but maybe for the sake of exploring it a little bit more. The neo-romanticists, as we kind of agreed, were a collection of interwar and also post-war artists who, in the main, went into other spaces beyond the ruined cities. Could you begin by saying why Bracewell should raise the shadows of these artists looking at your work? Do you feel a certain companionship?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a lot with him about that, and we both realised that we liked some elements of that world, if you like. Lots of the imagery that I think I've used, I mean, without grossly simplifying it, I suppose in some ways it could fall into two camps quite easily. And one is a kind of harder, urban, conflict-laden set of images, most of which are in this big piece here, early on. But over the years, and I suppose this might be partly, my interest comes from sort of punk and that kind of conflict, I suppose, and some of that imagery is directly quoted from that period of time, which was important to me, and to some extent still is, but was also kind of like a cultural thing. It wasn't just so autobiographical. But I suppose there was a shift that happened with me where that kind of, for want of a better phrase, alternative viewpoint sort of merged into other alternative viewpoints, and it went through a kind of green man-y kind of wicker interest, I suppose, and not quite to the extent that, Jamie Reed or somebody in kind of drew it to terms, but interesting nevertheless for me, and it kind of blurs into a kind of romantic landscape, and I mean romantic in a way like German romanticism or something in our terms, and then I suppose the sort of neo-romanticists that you mention are a kind of extension of that, and that then leads me into the sort of second set of images, which I do use a lot of natural leaves, twigs, branches in my thing, and it's sort of out of an interest in a silhouette in a thicket or something as well. I mean, there's a sort of formal link, and I suppose in a way, Michael sort of picked up on that as well, and could see that route through. And so there's a kind of, if we take it that world after the Second World War was very much about things organically growing out of a kind of ruined Europe, I suppose, then there are similarities visually, I think, with what I make.
Absolutely. I'm particularly thinking of a piece just on the eve of the Second World War by Sutherland for a series of works he called Entrance to a Lane. Earlier on you mentioned this notion of a portal into another world. And Sutherland, found his art, inverted commas, found his way of working once he got to Pembrokeshire, West Wales. So he means a lot to us, I suppose, in that sense, broadly speaking. But what we found there was this, if you like, an otherworldliness, but also a world that hadn't quite, or at least had been allowed on certain levels to be allowed to be itself. So he explored that notion of the thicket, and if you consider that we talked about certain drawings of his, there's a kind of silhouettiness about some of those solver drawings, which are essentially black ink. But there's a reduction of form, which is both reduced and minimal and eloquent, but also extraordinarily lyrical.
Yeah.
And I think it's that hint of lyricism which one can detect in your work with your scalpel.
Yes.
Your scalpel. So your scalpel, if you like, takes away, as you said, removes the negative, searching for a light or searching for form, and the edge where the bit that's cut away is removed. Obviously, it releases your contours, and so these contours, in a sense, depicting form, are akin to that linear quality of drawing, which you find with some of those artists, Keith Vaughan as well, and also someone else we mentioned, Alan Reynolds, slightly later generation. So that reductionism is quite interesting, and I wonder if you'd like to say something about the not the accident, but the means of the process reduces the imagery to a bare necessity, if you like.
It's an interest. Yes, it's funny. It's there's a delicate trade-off that I certainly. I mean, I don't really do the paper cutting things anymore. So in a way, I refer to it as something that I did do. Maybe I use stencils in a different way. But when I was making those kind of things, then there was a danger for me. They're quite graphic in a small g way. There's a sort of hard, kind of slightly poppy dynamic to the way it could look, and I was always kind of carefully trying to push that without overdoing the actual physical cutting. So it would be what would be the sort of minimal cut that I could make, which gives enough of a rendition of a particular image that I was working with, I suppose. So there's that element to it. But the other thing I was just thinking of is that the difference with these and with the paper cuts and the doilies that I was making was that they also have to hang together as a sort of web, and there's a sort of network that they make. They make their own network, because otherwise they don't hang together. And I think that's possibly also, there's a sort of tension then that I sort of made where I'm freed up in terms of what I can cut, but it still has to all still stay together, because it was always important to me that it did work as a sort of repeat and mirrored image, I suppose. But,
sure.
So the painting's less so.
Yeah, so the cut, the drawing, if you like, creates its own structure, which is important for you, because the whole thing would fall.
You can't cut the whole shape because the thing would fall apart, so you have to leave it.
Exactly. So that element then, it's two questions I'd like to ask on process. The line, when you cut, you have a choice, don't you? I told the story of Anna Maria Pacheco at Norwich for me, and she told me she suggested ways of cutting paper. You cut with a Stanley knife or a scissors, or you fold and tear, you reverse the paper, and you get all sorts of different choices in terms of edges. Your edges, I know you've moved on from this for the time being, but we still have edges here.
Yeah.
So how important is the decision of edge to the work for you in terms of the process and your decision making?
It's much more linked to the idea of a drawing, but not a kind of, I mean, I suppose in sort of art historical drawing terms, it ends up being more like a kind of Flaxman or a Hockney, for instance, in terms of that style, rather than a shaded Henry Moore or something, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I became quite obsessed with the edge and how I couldn't, because that's what I think artists do, is that, you know, you set up a series of parameters for yourself to work within and limits, and hopefully there's enough space within those parameters to let you do some journeying, but at some point, and often quite quickly, you get to the edge of that idea or physical idea, and so you're challenged by it. And it's a bit like when we talked a bit about painters. You know, I had friends who were painters, and I still do have friends who are painters, but they, you know, they would always be this kind of dilemma for them that they wouldn't, you know, one of the dilemmas, depending on what sort of work they made, I suppose, was that they didn't know when something was finished, and this was a sort of sense of anxiety for them, amongst many others, I'm sure. But I always thought it was quite funny that when I just had a bit of paper and I folded it into four, then, you know, I knew when I'd finished because I got to the edge. You know, there wasn't anything else I could cut physically, and that in itself was quite liberating. Over time, I became slightly obsessed, possibly in a way from something that happened like this, where, you know, a piece is hanging on a wall, the light shining through it, and then you get that kind of shadow play that happens, which I really like. But it looks completely different because it's slightly blurry and softer and all that sort of thing. So I then became obsessed with this idea of making something like that. And I tried all sorts of different ways of doing it, a bit like your anecdote about kind of folding and tearing and stuff. But it was never quite enough. I tried tracing paper and hanging them over the top of things. And it's sort of what led me to then make the spray paintings, because then I could suddenly... the blurry edge became the goal, but only because I couldn't make a blurry edge. It's a sort of stupidly self-imposed thing, but I think that's what artists do. And it was because of that hardness, which I did like, but it was quite a graphic looking hard edge, that led me to then do some of the other stuff, so I could get, you know, a blurry thing, which is, you know, that's just my particular
But you put that onto your, you
Yeah.
may use a palette as a metaphor, that becomes part of your artist's palette,
just
doesn't it?
becomes part,
The decision about, okay, what is that edge?
Yeah.
How can I explore it?
Yeah. It's very binary and edged, even
Absolutely.
as soft as furry as it is, you know.
Yeah. But those are aesthetic decisions that you're
Yeah.
making, and that's intriguing. Okay, so the second part of that then regarding process is once you explored the drawing in terms of cutting away or the edges, the thing is done, as you say, because the choice is made for you partially, because once you've cut, that's it.
Yeah.
Once you've sprayed to a certain degree, that's it. Although this is slightly different because we're layering, you could go back over. But you've just hinted at it really. So then you've got the thing, the piece, the object, the image that is made finally. There's another sort of freeing up, I think, isn't there? Because if you've kind of, on one level, celebrated the openness of playing with cutting edges, soft, hard, and all the rest of it, it follows that once you've actually got the thing made, when it is installed, there's another degree of freedom.
Yeah.
There's a flexibility I've noticed in your various people that have curated your work. Something like this changes really from place to place, depending on choices of hanging or the conditions of the space, height of the wall, ceiling, and so forth. What about that element of freedom, the way things are hung in terms of site of gallery?
Yeah, I can't. Early on, and in fact almost always, I knew straight from the beginning that the paper pieces should only hang very simply on a couple of nails or something. I mean, depending on how big they were. this was slightly more elaborate because it's such a big piece, but generally speaking, they and this possibly feeds back into the intimacy question of the work, because and there's a actually I'll come back to that, but it was important, very important to me, that these pieces were just simply hung on nails, because what would happen is even just the temperature of a room, and because it's paper, pieces would sag and shift, and it would look different one day to the next day, even in an exhibition, and that sort of gave them a kind of a character and a life, and that at that time, certainly within the sort of art world that I was part of, that was quite an odd idea. I felt that lots of the kind of doiliness and the sort of Victorianness of what I was doing at the beginning was a counterbalance to what I saw as quite a cool, minimal aesthetic. And it felt a bit too cold for me, and I kind of wanted to, I felt that I wanted to make something that was had a bit more personality to it, I suppose, for want of a better word. And there was something quite Sunday afternoon, rainy, colouring in drawing sort of ness about it that I sort of remembered as a child, that cutting these things out of paper and in a sort of childish, snowflakey way that pleased me in my mind and aesthetically, but also conceptually pleased me, because it felt like I was not in the rest of that world, which ties in with lots of other stuff we've been talking about. And I was starting, the initial idea for making these pieces was having left college, having no studio, having no money, possibly slightly cynical view of being able to survive and to be an artist, after spending all these years kind of being an art student. And how was this even going to exist? I mean, Jane said at the beginning that, lots of those big sort of group discussions happen when you're a student, and it's true. And I remember one of the last ones having with a group of other students in our studio was how we were going to continue to make work after we left. And it was a sort of hypothetical question, or discussion, but it was about whether you could survive and be an artist. And there were 70 people on the course at St Martin's when I was there, which seemed like a lot, which is nothing compared with what a course like that might now have. But we were sort of debating amongst ourselves who of us would still be doing it in a year's time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. And it was a sort of stupid conversation, but it was quite funny. And that if we were sort of all aware that the pressures to kind of knuckle down, get a job, pay off your debts might take over, and so many of our friends or past students had stopped making work and had disappeared. And it was a sort of, slightly romantic conversation, I suppose, and sort of idealistic conversation about how that might work. But it links back to the work. We were talking about how you could make work if you didn't have a studio and didn't have any money. And at one point, a couple of us said, what would be really great would be if we could make inflatable sculpture that was really enormous and baroque and elaborate. And then when you weren't showing it in a gallery, you could fold it back up and put it in a box and store it under your bed. And it was a sort of practical concern about storage and production, I suppose. And we actually all agreed this would be a really great way of making work. You could make some really enormous things, and they could be, we were talking about bouncy castles and all of that kind of technology. Yeah. None of us, as far as I know, ever did it. I did try once to make something that was inflatable, but it was a complete disaster because all of that sort of heat sealing and your valves and that thing. So we didn't go very far. But in a weird sort of way and a sort of roundabout series of events, I ended up making, with the doilies, the next best thing, which was something that I could just do on a table. I could fold it up afterwards, and it could go in a drawer or something, and you could kind of build up quite a little body of work quite quickly.
In fact, David Mellor, I think, a writing of your work, said something very similar. He said that to give Simon Periton a decent retrospective, you just really would need a carrier bag.
Like a carrier bag, yeah, decent size, yeah, it's true.
Depending how he folds it.
Well, I mean,
literally what you're saying.
in a way,
and that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's incredibly flexible, and it's incredibly liberating, isn't it? It's not a million miles away from what you were saying about the wall, how you tackled the wall. You have a given space, and before you do anything, you say, that is the work. The work is there. It's an empty wall. What I now have to do is just make a series of marks or adjustments. But wherever they are, and whenever I choose to stop, it still remains that scale. Yeah. And that's a conceptual acceptance, which I find personally also very liberating.
There's a neat and tidiness to it, isn't
there
there?
is. It's fine. It's because then it's a comfort, isn't it? Because, okay, I could have a bad day tomorrow when I get to the studio or the gallery where I'm installing. But if nothing happens, it's okay, because I did make a mark the previous day, and I may make another one tomorrow. But there's still a dialogue or a discourse happening across that space between that mark and that mark. Because if you've made a mark over there, and you've made a mark over there, you've united two distances, two corners, so that they're reaching over.
There's a relationship.
There is a relationship, and they're reaching over conceptually. So then it's a matter of, okay, what else should I do to that conversation? What else should I add in?
That's also, I think, linked to when one might hang a show or put a show together. You might. Some artists meticulously plan with 3D models and SketchUp Pro and all that stuff now, exactly where things will go in a show and make the work to fit. I haven't really ever done that. I mean, maybe once or twice, but generally speaking, I make a set of works which are related to each other, but then the installing is actually another whole creative process, and where you place something in relation to something else is really interesting. And in a funny sort of way, you end up, I actually think that most of what I do is about constellations and the way. And constellations are, of course, fictitious and wrong in so many ways, and yet they do work on another level. So there's something about the untruth about that which I quite like. And you make, by making new relationships or interplays between an anarchy there or a bug there or something, in a different space, makes a different conversation, makes a different meaning.
And what you're dealing with there, you're sort of sounding off, or you're responding, I guess, to the nuances of a given space when you make those decisions. So the constellations include aspects of the space as well. So that also is important. And of course, some of students are here from Swansea, and we talk about that a lot. About it's one thing to make work in a studio situation, or not. It could be an alternative way of making work. But then the other bit is installation. It is curating. That is part of the manipulation of your work, the organisation of your work within a given space.
I think you have to be, ideally I would want to be as free in that new interpretation as possible. I mean, I know that, I've got friends who are not able to be that free about that situation, and things have to be exactly how they planned them. And I can see that that's just how they are, but for me, I think it's interesting the way you could completely change something at the last moment. I mean, we can talk about that with you on the return match maybe, but but it's it does relate to your
definitely. Not so much now for me, but we'll talk about London Return. But certainly that we definitely share that notion of an invitation to do a show somewhere, and what I'll do, I literally have said I'll bring my bag of tricks, and we'll just see what happens. But that's really. It's a difficult one because it gives you anxiety.
It's quite brave.
In a sense, it's madness.
Yeah.
Well, mad or brave, not sure. I don't know. The two are probably related.
Yeah.
But also it does give you a sense of anxiety. But it is also enriching because you're given over the possibility of a reading, the materials, the object made with the space. So if you're doing that as an artist, in the sense you're inviting your audience to, in a way, have a likewise relationship, to respond in flexible ways.
Yeah.
That nothing is particularly fixed, in a sense, because an idea is fairly fluid, in terms of a studio centre. So that's really interesting. So thanks for that. I just want to move slightly away as a point of question now to maybe content. Your War, My Love.
Yeah, Your War, My Love. Yeah.
Placed here. So this piece is several years back in its original conception, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like 1996, I think.
Okay.
So it's one of the. I only started doing the paper cut things in the year before, so it's quite an early one.
Okay, so you mentioned, what's used a lot in essays about your work is obviously the Victorian aspect, or the doilies and so on, the doily aesthetic. And with the doily aesthetic, we have, conjures up ideas of domesticity, familiar life, internal life, internal existences. The doily is also about a kind of, what's the word? An assumption of tidiness, of presentation.
Yeah.
So it's got all of that around it as well. That notion, put together with the suggestions within these particular this imagery, skull-like forms, thorn-like forms, your War, My Love. You talked earlier on about sort of two worlds together, your sort of post-punk aesthetic merged with a kind of romanticism as well, so you've got a duality. Is there a similar duality, counterpoints, two counterpoints working within a piece like this? The doily reference, domesticity, internal, tidy, and the other thing which is out of controlness, possibly masculinity without pushing that button too far. But can you talk about those two worlds?
I could talk lots about that. The idea for making the doilies in the first place was that I wanted to make something which was very decorative. I didn't actually know what I wanted to make at this point, but what I sort of thought conceptually I wanted to achieve or get to was a place where I was able to spend a lot of time and effort in sort of hours making something which possibly would be decorative, and also possibly quite beautiful to look at, but was essentially sort of worthless or pointless or something. And that was a sort of post-college, wake up, slight cynicism or something. But it did also connect with some other things that I was kind of interested in, and in that way that I felt things were being sort of quite cool and minimal, I suppose, around me. Then there's a part of that sends me deliberately into a world which I think is sort of uncool, if you like, or not particularly fashionable at that time. And so I was looking in the sort of search to try and find what I might be making work about or something. Then I was looking at sort of Aubrey Beardsley or Christopher Dresser, or even like sort of Far Eastern mandalas and patterns and stuff. Things that were sort of not in my immediate scope, if you will, or world. And by chance, actually, I was doing something and spraying through a doily onto a record, which was a part of some other thing that happened. And this doily sort of fell on the floor with all this paint on it, and I didn't see it straight away. Maybe like a week or two later, I suddenly picked up this thing, and it just occurred to me in a really dumb way, really, that this thing that I was looking at was this doily. It had been painted, but it was still just a doily. Kind of summed up everything that I was, and I hadn't even started making the cutouts or anything at this point. Kind of summed everything up. It was, highly decorative, looked like it had taken a lot of effort to make it, but whose sole purpose in life really was just to live between a cake and a plate, and then it was thrown away. And it was just all about genteel presentation or something, you know.
Yeah, aspiration was the word I was looking for.
Yeah,
aspiration of gentility.
Yes, exactly.
But
it's
also
about being
disposable fun.
sophisticated,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
thrown away.
Yeah.
And so that's what led me to make start making the cutouts, really. And so at the time, I wasn't, you know, you could be in lots of shows with mates in London. It was a sort of beginning of what became that sort of London art. Lots of people doing lots of different things in different colleges, in different little old shops or warehouses, wherever anybody could get a space on. But no one was really making a living as an artist or something. And it just, you know, you were just going round and round, going to all your friends' private views, and you know, that art world was probably 200 people that just went to the same pub on a sort of rotating business, process. And I suppose in a way I sort of felt like I was a bit on a treadmill. And so I decided I was going to go to all my friends' things, but I wasn't going to do any of those shows for a bit. I was just going to take a year out and just do some stuff in the studio and sort of settle myself and see where I was. And it was in that year that I started making these paper cut things. And so I'd go to, you know, friends' private views and stuff in the evening, and they would talk about what they were making and what the show was, and we, you know, all those discussions. And then people say, well, you know, sometimes people say, what have you been working on? And I say, well, I've just been making doilies in my studio. And the look of horror on people's faces, just to even use the word doily, was such that they would say, oh, you mean like paper cuts? Because that was sort of arty, you know, and acceptable. And I thought, do you know what? I actually think they're doilies, because it seems to really annoy you so much. There's something about it. So that's why they were, certainly for the first year or so, they were called doilies. And they would be called doilies, you know, if I appropriated an image from somebody that I liked, like a Christopher Dresser design or something, or maybe I did one for the Archer's Target from the Powell and Pressburger movie, because I like that, and that has a link with that sort of neo-romantic world. Then they became things like a doily for Christopher Dresser or a doily for Michael Powell. So they were sort of, in a contemporary sense, it was more about how, you know, rappers were kind of acknowledging, you know, the backtrack for something that they were doing, and that was seen as some sort of, it was more democratic or something, that it would be acknowledged or something in terms of, you know, producing a new bit of work. And I quite like that, because it also introduced an intimacy to something. So titles became quite important quite early on. So hardly anything is ever untitled unless it's by accident. But most things actually end up having titles.
But for you, titling is a way of just giving a little bit more. Is it
just pushing it in a different direction?
It's giving a key, a way in somehow.
Yeah, sometimes it's a way in, sometimes it's a way out. You know,
right.
It maybe directs you in a different way, or the intention is that it would direct the viewer in a different way. Sometimes just by, you know, it's not quite oak tree with a glass of water on a shelf, but there's an element of that sometimes in it. Sometimes it could, I mean, I know that's a kind of completely different thing, but just in the putting together of that phrase with that image creates.
And I suppose
it's a sort of, it comes from film. It's quite Eisenstein-y, and it's, you know, making a third meaning from a montage, I suppose. It's like that it works like that for me a bit. Just push. It can just lean somebody in a direction that I want them to go, or deliberately lean them away from a more obvious reading. So,
I mean, on one level, was it subverting a certain convention? But
yes,
through
it's about subversion.
Subversion,
sure.
definitely, but also, by contrast, retrieving something of that conceptual input. So
it's a game that I play all the time.
Yeah. So you're pushing and you're pulling.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. And I do lots of. Over the last few years, I've got quite interested in sort of alchemical images and alchemical ideas, and part of the joy for that, for me, is the kind of the game playing and the tricks about leading yourself down a path and then realising it was a sort of dead end, maybe conceptually coming back. But it's also about words round the wrong way. It's kind of there's a French Cockney, isn't there, called Verlan or something, where they switch words round and change the masculine and the feminine. It makes a new thing. I love things like that. Or anagrams. I use anagrams a lot in titles for work. So.
Absolutely. But going back, everything you've said about the notion of using initially the notion of the doily and then subverting certain conventions, retrieving some of it back. Once you've got that aesthetic, right, I've got my. I know what I'm going to do at this moment in the studio. The content that you're then beginning to cut out of all those things, which includes the subversions, how do you get to something like your War, My Love?
Okay, so then I suppose for me, I became interested in the idea that anything could be decorative and anything could be. It's a sort of Rorschach-y test on one hand, but it's also just about repetition and mirroring, and there's a seduction which happens with that. So when you have an image where you've cut it like a snowflake, for want of a better phrase, then for me the joy of that was it sort of, when you opened it out, there's two things actually about that. First is I was making work that I didn't actually know how it looked until I'd finished it and opened it up. There's a sort of sense of childlike wonder of not really knowing how something's going to look until you've taken it apart and opened it up. And as banal and as silly as that might appear, that is also quite liberating. And it's almost like you're not totally in control because you don't know how it's going to look until you've committed to it being finished. But on another level, it suggests a kind of an infinite possibility, because you have, if it's an image that's four, for instance, you have one corner of the image which is the image the right way round, you have it back to front, and you have it upside down, and you have it upside down and back to front. So conceptually, that suggests an infinite expansion for me, but all within the limits of one sheet of paper, for instance. So that became interesting. So then in terms of what the imagery could be, it could kind of be anything, because it's the repetition that becomes seductive, and possibly the meaning of the image is completely lost because it's only about the repetition and all that, which is, it's not a million miles away from a sort of blank Warhol electric chair or something, but there was a sort of daintiness and an intimacy to it by doing it with paper that I thought was interesting. So the imagery tended to be, it might be punk stuff. So even though some of these images are, they come from a kind of hardness, I suppose, as a sort of teenager, then actually they reduce just to a kind of pattern. I mean, the Anarchy A one was quite an early one. As a teenager, that was the hardest thing you could do, do anarchy, oral anarchy. But actually, it was just a kind of Busby Berkeley routine dance.
But is that your natural cynicism coming into play?
It's very cynical, yeah. But I am quite naturally cynical. But in a quite playful way. I quite like that.
But with a title like Your War, My Love, it has memories of another title, Oh What a Lovely War.
Yeah.
It senses up a critique. It suggests a critique on some certain level beyond the cynicism about what the hell we're all doing.
Yeah.
And I think when you've got a lurid pink-ish, doily-esque thing, which is about all the things that you've suggested, put into that cynicism, that sort of fuck you mentality, a certain. It does raise. I think it raises the stakes in terms of a question about what a lovely war. What is it? What is it good for?
Yeah.
War.
Yeah. Absolutely nothing.
I was trying to remember the best thing. Thank you. But it doesn't do that. is that important? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Is there an awareness of that?
Yeah, and it was, yes. Your War, My Love, as a title, I always thought of it in two ways, and I'm never quite sure which one I think, depending on which mood I'm in. It's either Your War, My Love, as is, you know, it's your war, you can have it as a gift or whatever, or it's Your War is My Love, you know, I always had that double play for me.
But can I just add, in the context of this show,
Yeah.
you know, I know it's been created for this particular moment and this celebration of, not celebration, but remembrance of 100 years. The notion of an exchange of thoughts, let's say maybe on a simple postcard from a guy in the trenches to his loved one back at home.
Yeah.
You know, it's got that sort of messaging, partly because of the context of the current show.
Yeah.
So you can't help but have that sense of the intimacy, the home life, the domestic life, those left and those over there.
Yeah, sure.
And it brings those two worlds together somehow. Particularly then when we go back to the thicket-like quality of the forest beyond the field. 2 years ago I went down to Mametz Wood as part of a project. Now Mametz Wood now is fully grown again, but it's where thousands of young lads just got shot down within a few days essentially.
Yeah.
But it is a woods. After the war it became not a woods because every tree bar one was completely shattered.
Yeah.
But the trees that were there and that have now returned are like thicket-like, and it conjures up ideas of
because it's been pruned in a really vicious way. Or
no, it's funny because I think who was it who spoke about the bird song? It must have been David Jones. I think talked about the bird song had gone.
Yeah.
The bird song is now back.
Yeah.
It's back actually tenfold. It's quite extraordinary, and you can really hear the birds at Mametz Woods now because the trees have grown back. But that notion of the woods and the thicket and the world beyond, I'm thinking of, it must be Milton's Comus, those kind of mask pieces, where if you get to the edge of the forest and you go into the forest, then something else happens. It's another world. Yeah. But with this, it's a similar kind of echo of something that's gone, something that's lost over there. It's going back to the notion of peeking through a thicket in order to find some light, some given place of escape. But that's for me, that's the echoes are there. Your war, my love. In the context of this curating, can't help but sort of conjure up interpretations. Do you accept that? Or?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting because that isn't the context that the work was obviously made in. And in fact, the images of conflict within the piece none of them are from the First or Second World War at all. There's lots of most of the images I chose to use from it actually have a sort of level of absurdity for me, which is just an interest in images that I have anyway. There's quite a lot of stuff in there that is not immediately apparent, but I know is in there because I know that it went into the collage that made it. But deciding to show it in the context of this show with these two pieces and the brick wall, I suppose in a way it's not and even these pieces aren't made about the war at all, really. I mean, they're to do with a family story of mine, really, but they're to do with, and maybe it's easier to read that through these in a way, where there's a sort of it's a silhouette of a member of my family that I never knew, that came about through a sort of massive family story and revelation about something to do with my mum, who was adopted in war. and finding out lots of stuff that we've never known before. And on the one hand, finding out stuff, but also not really understanding any of it and not really knowing how to process that. And I suppose in the context of this... Sorry, no, next week,
yeah. I gotta go. Yeah, take care.
And I suppose there's a kind of reading of of loss and memory that might be to do with this as well, because part of the concept for making this piece was it's a sort of an amalgamation of maybe half a dozen or 10 earlier cutouts that I had been making, none as big as this. And then when I was asked to make something for another space, which this was made for, I wanted to make something. I remember telling the curator that I kind of had this idea to make a really large paper piece that was almost like Rodin's Gates of Hell, or whatever it is. And it was going to be an overload of all of the imagery that I'd sort of been working with up until that point. Lots of it to do with terrorists reading at press conferences, or police from the miners' strike, or from a race riot from Notting Hill or something, which were all images of conflict that were to do with my childhood in a way, and how I'd sort of, grown up with those things on the news, and was kind of interested in reprocessing them in some way through the work. So it sort of becomes a bit about memory and violence as well. And I suppose in that context, that's how I sort of view this kind of constellation. I mean, the hole in the wall is from a photograph that I took. On its own, it doesn't really make any connection between these, but within the context of this constellation, it's a bit like when I saw that in the street near where my studio was in London. A car had obviously mounted the pavement and just gone into the wall, but I took it within the first month of me making these things where I was cutting out, and it just struck me that the car was a scalpel basically, and the brick wall was a sheet of paper, and whoever had been driving the car was just doing what I was doing. It was it's quite a beautiful image, I thought, but it's also potentially a violent image, although it may have just been an accident, and no one was hurt and the car's fine.
But I suppose it's that thing about curating works, isn't it? It's going back to that point. 1, 2, 3 aspects to the show, which you pull together.
Yeah.
And it's the occurrence of that pulling together that creates the other idea.
Yeah.
It's the interpretation of the whole, then, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think that's what you're really talking about.
It can be difficult, I think, that as well, because very often people make work, and then in the last 15, 20 years, the notion of the curator has become much more a sort of starring role, if you like, a bit more like a kind of it's a bit like a kind of DJ in some ways,
yes.
Playing somebody else's records, and sometimes you see, and I don't think this is that situation, but I've definitely been to shows where there's been a curated theme, and you feel like things have been really sort of shoehorned in to fit because they're a famous bit of work or something. And that can often happen in shows that happen in the Tate or something, where they have something in a collection, they want to get it out, and they'll find a way of rerouting that in. Yeah. And sometimes it's glaringly obvious. Sometimes it can twist the meaning of something and give it a different reading, which is I think what happens with this in the context of that.
Yeah, and I think that's reasonable. We accept the context shift of forever shifts, don't they? So something new will at one point be historical, another point in time, and then that could be brought back into play. I mean, in a sense, on one level, you're talking about a certain distancing of incidents. So you, as the artist, can have a little bit more space to consider the impact of, say, what you've just said earlier on about conflict, memories of conflict, allows you to consider it more. It's rather like when, 9/11 happened. People didn't touch it. They didn't.
Yeah.
Artists did not want to touch 9/11.
Yeah.
And one of the first was Steve Reich, but because he was invited to respond within 5 years, he refused. And I think it took him about between 10 and 15 years to have a little bit of distance. Even that was quite close, in some ways, to begin a response to that trauma. But I guess that's what's at play here, is a distancing of certain things, both the artworks, but also the memory of a family portrait, I should say.
Yeah.
But we still definitely, through your process, we've definitely got an empty space
Yeah.
that once was an individual.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's made solid purely by the courtesy of light going through your cut. I mean, I'll finish on that. I mean, is that reasonable as an interpretation for you?
Yeah, I think there's also...
That the spirit of the content is now on the wall. I can see it, because I'm sitting here, I can see very clearly the one behind you. I can see a figure that once that work is removed, will no longer be there.
Yeah, I think that's... Yeah. There's also, in a way, it's a good place for it to stop it maybe, is that there's also a photographic analogy for me, which that these are kind of like large glass negatives or something, and they have that kind of, especially with the silvering and stuff. There was always the idea that it came from a photograph, and then it sort of was like it's not a daguerreotype or something as
absolutely,
such,
and the hold on the reality is
way.
temporal.
Yeah,
it will be removed.
It's just a ghost of an image.
Absolutely,
that then you might capture or not.
Yeah. Great. I think I might stop there and hand it over to everyone else to ask questions.
I just want to say something about curation, because yes, there was a sense that there wasn't a direct reference to war, but then for me it was about memory and inner conflict. And when you read about the First World War, it is about a very brutal war, but it's all of the after effects and all of the stuff that stays with you and goes with you, and the things that happen in your mind and the things that happen in your brain. And for me, that piece is very much about inner conflict, because it's so confusing and overwhelming. It's also the most macho but yet feminine piece I've seen. It's 8 meters, it's 2 meters wide, it's bombastic, it's full of farts, it's full of, kind of quite, vulgar imagery, but it's so feminine as well. It was amazing it being installed. There was like 7 or 8 people with a tower, a scaffolding tower, delicately placing it. It was such a kind of conflict of feminine and masculine that I really enjoyed that. And especially with the photographs, it's like you said, you found the photographs and then you used them. It's like so many of us found out about relatives of us that have been very involved in the war, but we didn't really know. And I think it's something to do with that kind of memory of you find a photograph and then you ask a question, because people don't talk about war. Because when people came back from war, it's the last thing they wanted to talk about, and they had to live with all of the stuff that went with it, the kind of, the memories and the aftershock. So for me, that's why I really felt it fitted into the remembrance, of the First World War, which was going on in Swansea. But anyway, thank you. That was the curator.
You have a question?
It's nice that you've explained exactly what it's all about. I mean, before I knew all of that, when I came to the private view and when I came in here today, it just says to me so much about army kind of those nets, those
like a camouflage net.
Nets,
Yeah.
And I quite like that you've done the opposite of that, because it's bright pink. It's definitely not camouflage. It's like in your that's, subconsciously there's kind of elements of war, echoed in that piece like that. And it reminded me that during the war, they employed artists actually to design
to do camouflage,
gear,
do dazzle,
exactly, so that they were kind of camouflaged, and it kind of reminded me of that. But this is definitely in your it's not camouflaged, it's not sort of a secret, or it's in your face, isn't it? And I quite like that
Yeah.
you kind of brought it out into the open rather than being discreet and unseen and kind of blended into the background, really.
Well, I'm glad that you like the camouflage net of it, because that's what it struck me.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't meant to be installed
You haven't
like this.
mentioned that at all.
No. I haven't really talked about the way we installed the idea for the installation, but because it's far too big a piece to show in one go. And it's only apart from the show it was made for. I think it went to different places. I've never shown it since then, so it was quite a nice idea to see how it would work in a smaller space. Although actually this is quite a big space, but when we were hanging it, but getting that curve was to make it feel like a kind of
I like that temporary element
like
of
a
it.
tent in a desert or something that you would put up to.
Exactly, because they had these sort of temporary installations, and you could just chuck over something to kind of give them camouflage somewhere. So it's like that, but then it's not, because it's kind of in your face and it's bright pink.
You've also hit on the pink thing, which I've not really talked about, which was that, and it was possibly to do. I mean, I did lots of different colours, and I've cut things out of lots of different coloured papers and stuff over the years, but the fluorescent pink thing was always really important because it was so in your face as a colour that it felt like the most modern colour I could think of at the time.
Popular colour as well.
It was very popular at this point, but
I think it's actually referred to. Somebody said to me years ago when I had a little daughter, and they were all dressed up as fairies and things like that. She said, "Oh, a sexy pink," and I think that's actually the colour it is. It's a sexy pink.
When I started making these things, I'd be in shows and I sometimes would go, along to the opening or something, and people would be quite surprised that it was like me making them and not a woman making them.
Yeah.
And they made all those assumptions about the delicacy of a cut and lacy doily. I mean, all horrible preconceptions. Yeah, and gay stuff, and then the fact that it was a sort of that pink for girls, blue for boys. Nonsense anyway. And it never even occurred to me really until other people started saying it that it was even an issue. For me, it was about the pinkness being. It was so in your face and so obviously about a surface that you couldn't deny it, that it refocused the idea of cutting the surface, if you like. That was the reason I liked it, and it was a sort of big acid housey colour or something. You couldn't, all the things that you said really, you can't deny it's there. It's completely uncamouflaged, and yet in a sort of funny way. There was that funny cartoon, Undercover Elephant, that and no one, massive big thing in dark glasses that everybody always kind of didn't see in the real world. Yeah, completely incognito. So in some ways, you think you've made something which people can't help but have to deal with, but actually, because it's something maybe repetitive and decorative, and therefore sort of pleases some part of your brain which wants to makes it, and it kind of covers it up, and you ignore it, which in a way is what links back to the content of the imagery about maybe the content of these images aren't ever dealt with. I went and saw the Peter Jackson They Shall Not Grow Old film, and I went and saw it with in Barty, which is where I live. I'm a member of this sort of cinema. And they do silver screenings, so screenings for like the over 70s or something. And I went to one of these ones. It was quite a fascinating thing to see that film anyway, but to see it with essentially everybody around you kind of watching the generation that would be their parents or something in this film was really interesting. And there were bits at the beginning where it was quite a rowdy audience. It was a really interesting way to see it. I love films where everybody shouts at the cinema. I think it's really great. But there's a bit at the beginning. I mean, it's a beautiful. If you haven't seen it, it's an amazing film. But there's bits at the beginning when they're talking about, they've got guys who I guess must have been recorded in the 1960s and 70s, because most of them wouldn't be around now, talking about how they went to sign up at the age of 13, 14, 15, 16 or something, and were told to kind of go outside and come back in after you've had a couple of birthdays and all that sort of stuff. And it was all kind of jolly and funny, and all of the people around me that were older were laughing about this thing. And I was just horrified, actually. I was just sitting there thinking that all it does is just reaffirm there's some sort of state complicit child abuse, really. I mean, sending these kids off to war. But the other thing that they talked about at the end of the film was when everybody came back and no one would talk about it. No one would talk about that stuff. And that has kind of just transferred down through all those generations as an undealt with psychological trauma. And one might argue that we're in a very similar scenario because of, or related scenario directly because of that, because no one ever dealt with that stuff, and families not knowing what other members of their previous generations were doing and not discussed.
No, it was not at all. Any other points at all? Questions?
About the pink.
Okay.
When I first saw about the pink, I thought it was about reclaiming the pink as it used to be like male and female used to be like blue. I don't know, before 17th century. And I think it was something to do with that, about this construction of the pink as a kind of a power thing, and something to do with romanticism. I was thinking. But yeah, I guess it's not.
It wasn't really. I mean, I like pink. It's one of my favourite colours, especially pink. And I suppose that in itself might be odd, but it's never a bit odd to me at all. But I had pink hair when I was like 16, so that was quite weird for the time. But the only other people that would talk to you, most people ignored you, but the only people that I remember having the best conversations with were all the old ladies that had blue and pink rinses, and they were stunned because they were having like their kind of rinse in the local hairdressers, and we were buying crazy colour in London. You can buy it, Kent. And so you would have like beacons of like hair colour. I mean, it's quite common now, but at the time it was quite unusual. And I never even thought anything about that at the time. I mean, there was a sort of punk sexual mix match, contradiction inherent in it. So it was never an issue, but it just came. For me, there was no issue with that at all. It was just taken as read. I have the same conversations with my daughter now, who's 13, about different sorts of gender fluidity, and that whole generation is just taking that for granted in a way that we've had to learn it a bit more. I think it's quite fascinating, all of that stuff.
Isn't it like mixed a little bit blue and red in it? And I don't know, there is a bit of that. Some kind of mix of conflict or something, because it's not very natural color, isn't it? It's quite like an constructed color. There is something about very much.
Yeah. It's sort of it's not natural, is it? In so many ways, but
something about that.
Any other questions or points for Simon? Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you very
much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Time for tea.
I've just been making some tea. And it's an amazing cake, but just thank you so much, because I think that did exactly what I wanted it to do, because the kind of precious angles of the questions about process and things, they were artist to artists, and that's exactly what we were looking for.
Can I just say something that's just reminded me, as a sort of ending thing, which I think is quite funny, is that when I was like 14 or something, then I was punk, and I wanted to go. I had to travel across Kent to see my grandmother, who lived in another part of Kent, and I was going on my own with my brother, and it was when I was sort of first a punk, and so I had, and I didn't have like the expensive clothes from stationers or anything like that, but we used to make all our stuff, and I had an old blazer with a zip in the back of it, and I had an armband that I'd made that had an Anna Kie on it. and my hair was all sort of stuck up. It wasn't pink yet, it was too early. But then, and I was sort of snarling a bit on the bus with my brother, and we went over on this journey, had to change a couple of buses and get to my grandmother's. We eventually got there, and when she opened the door, she said to me, "What's that on your arm?" And I said, "It's anarchy, Gran." And she went, "That's nice, dear. Would you like some tea?" And at the time, I was like, sort of, pent up aggression. You don't understand, you don't understand me, typical. But really quickly over the years, and in a way, it was always the thing that I used to talk about with doilies, was that I realised that in a funny sort of way, her response in that beautifully Joyce Grenfell-y English way was probably more rebellious in its stance than my anarchy army. So, and now we're having tea. This is great.
Thank you.
Really?
And there is that cake.